Part 8, Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. The day on which Sergey Ivanovitch reached Pokrovskoye had been unusually full of torment for Levin. It was at that hurried, busy season of the year when all the peasantry are engaged in putting forth an extraordinary effort and showing an endurance which are quite unknown in the ordinary conditions of their lives, and which would be prized very highly if it were not repeated each year and did not produce such very simple results. Mowing and sowing rye and oats, reaping, harvesting, threshing, these are labors which seem simple and commonplace, but to accomplish them in the short time accorded by nature, everyone, old and young, must set to work. For 3 or 4 weeks they must be content with the simplest fare, black bread, garlic, and kvass, must sleep only a few hours, and must not pause night or day, and every year this happens throughout all Russia. Having lived the larger part of his life in the country and in the closest relations with the peasantry, Levin always at harvest time felt that this universal activity among the people embraced his own life. In the early morning he had gone to the field of early rye, to the field where they were carrying off the oats in ricks. Then he came back to breakfast with his wife and sister-in-law, and had afterward gone off on foot to the farm where he was trying a new threshing machine. This whole day, Levin, as he talked with the overseer and the muzhiks in the field, as he talked at the house with his wife and Dolly and the children and his father-in-law, thought of only one thing, and constantly the same questions pursued him. What am I? And where am I? And why am I here? As he stood in the cool shadow of his newly thatched barn, where the hazelwood timbers, still smelling of the fragrant leaves, held down the straw to freshly peeled aspen timbers that made the roof, Levin gazed, now through the open doors, where whirled and played the dry and choking dust thrown off by the threshing machine, now at the hot sunlight lying on the grass of the threshing floor, and at the fresh straw just brought out of the barn, and now at the white-breasted swallows with their spotted heads, as they flew about twittering and settling under the eaves, or, shaking their wings, darted through the open doors. And then again at the peasantry, bustling about in the dark and dusty barn, and strange ideas came into his mind. Why is all this done? He asked himself. Why am I standing here? Why am I compelling them to work? And why are they working so hard? Why are they doing their best in my presence? Why is my old friend, Matryona, putting in so with all her might? I cured her when a beam fell on her at the fire, he said to himself as he looked at a hideous old baba, who was walking with bare, sunburned feet across the hard, uneven soil, and was plying the rake vigorously. She got well then, but if not today or tomorrow, then in 10 years she must be borne to her grave, and there will be nothing left of her, nor of that pretty girl in red who is husking corn with such graceful, swift motions. They will bury her, and that dappled gelding will soon die, he thought, as he looked at the horse, breathing painfully with distended nostrils and heavily sagging belly, as it struggled up the ever-descending treadmill. They will carry him off, and Fyodor, the machine-tender, with his curling beard full of chaff, and his white shoulder showing through a tear in his shirt. They will carry him off too. But now he gathers up the sheaves and gives his commands, and shouts to the women, and, with quick motions, arranges the belt on the machine. And it will be the same with me. They will carry me away, and nothing of me will be left. Why? And, in the midst of his meditations, he mechanically took out his watch to calculate how much they threshed in an hour. It was his duty to do this so that he could pay the men fairly for their day's work. So far, only 3 ricks, he said to himself, and he went to the machine-tender and, trying to make his voice heard above the racket, told him to work faster. You've put in too much at once, Fyodor. You see it stops, so it wastes time. Do it more regularly. Fyodor, his face black with dust and sweat, shouted back some unintelligible reply, but entirely failed to carry out Levin's directions. He mounted the drum and took Fyodor's place and began to do the feeding. He worked thus till it was the muzhik's dinner hour, not a very long time, and then, in company with Fyodor, he left the barn and talked with him, leaning against a beautifully stacked pile of yellow rye, saved for planting. Fyodor was from a distant village, the very one where Levin had formerly let the association have some land. Now it was rented to a dvornik. Levin talked with Fyodor about this land, and asked him if it were not possible that Platon, a rich and trustworthy muzhik of his village, would take it for the next year. "Price too high. Won't catch Platon, Konstantin Dmitrich," replied the muzhik, wiping the chaff off from his sweaty chest. "Yes, but how does Kirillov make money out of it?" "Mittuich," by this contemptuous diminutive Fyodor called the dvornik. "What doesn't he make money out of? He puts on the screws and gets the last drop. He has no pity on the peasants. But Uncle Fokanuich," so he called the old man Platon, "does he try to fleece a man? And he gives credit when anyone owes him. He does not try to squeeze it out of them. He's that kind of a man." "Yes, but why does he give them credit?" "Well, of course men differ. One lives for his belly, like Mittuich. But Fokanuich, he's an honest man. He lives for his soul. He remembers God." "How does he remember God and live for his soul?" exclaimed Levin eagerly. "Why, that's plain enough. It's to live according to God, according to the truth. People differ. Take you, Konstantin Dmitrich, for example. You couldn't wrong a man." "Yes. Prashai, good-bye," exclaimed Levin, deeply moved, and taking his cane, he turned toward the house. As he recalled the muzhik's words, how Fokanuich lived for his soul according to God, according to truth, confused but weighty thoughts arose within him from some hidden source, and filled his soul with their brilliant light. Chapter 11. Part 8, Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Levin, with long steps, strode along the highway, filled not so much with his thoughts, he could not as yet get rid of them, as with a spiritual impulse, such as he had never known before. The peasant's words had had in his soul the effect of an electric spark, suddenly condensing the cloud of dim, incoherent thoughts which had not ceased to fill his mind, even while he was talking about the letting of his field. He felt that some new impulse, inexplicable as yet, filled his heart with joy. Not to live for oneself, but for God. What God? Could he have said anything more meaningless than what he said? He said that we must live, not for ourselves, that is, for what interests and pleases us, but for something incomprehensible, for God, whom no one knows or can define. Still, call it nonsense. Did I understand Fyodor? Didn't I also feel convinced of its truth? Did I find it either false or absurd? Nay, I understood it, and find in it the same meaning as he finds, and understood it more completely and clearly than anything else in life. And not alone I, but all the world, perfectly understand this, and have no doubt of it, and are unanimous in its favor. And I was seeking for miracles, and regretting that I could not see one which might fill me with amazement. A material miracle would have seduced me, but the real miracle, the only one possibly existing, surrounds me on all sides, and I have not remarked it. Fyodor says Kirillov, the dvornik, lives for his belly. I know what he means by that. No rational being, none of us, can live in any other way. But Fyodor says, too, that it is wrong to live for the belly, but that we should live for the truth, for God, and I know what that means as well. I, and millions of men, muzhiks and sages who have thought and written on the subject, or in their obscure language have talked about it, in the past and in the present. We are in accord on one point, and that is, that we should live for the good. The only knowledge that I and all men possess that is clear, indubitable, absolute, is here. We have not reached it by reason. Reason excludes it, for it has neither cause nor effect. The good, if it had a cause, would cease to be the good. If it had an effect, a reward, it would cease to be the good. The good must be outside of the chain of cause and effect. And I know this, and we all know it. Can there be greater miracle than this? Have I really found the solution of my doubts? Shall I cease to suffer? Levin asked himself as he followed the dusty road, insensible to weariness and heat, and feeling that his long travail was at an end. The sensation was so delightful that he could not believe that it was true. He choked with emotion. His strength failed him, and he left the high road and went into the woods, and sat down under the shadow of an aspen on the unmown grass. He uncovered his moist forehead, and stretched himself out on the succulent wood-grass, and leaned his head on his hand. Yes, I must reflect and consider, he thought, looking attentively at the untrodden grass in front of him, and watching the movements of an earth-beetle crawling up the stalk of couch-grass and stopped by a leaf. What discovery have I made? He said to himself, removing the leaf from the beetle's way, and bending down another stalk of couch-grass to help the beetle on. What made me so happy? What discovery have I made? I have made no discovery. I have only opened my eyes to what I already know. I have learned to recognize that power which formerly gave me life, and gives me life again today. I have freed myself from error. I have come to know my Master. I used to say there was going on in my body, in the body of this grass, in the body of this beetle. The beetle did not want to go to the other stalk, but spread its wings and flew away. Incessant change of matter, in conformity to certain physical, chemical, and physiological laws. And in all of us, together with the aspens and the clouds, and the nebulae, there was evolution. Evolution from what? Into what? Endless evolution and conflict. But was conflict with the infinite possible? And I was surprised to find nothing along this line, in spite of my best efforts, which could reveal to me the meaning of my life, my motives, my longings. But the consciousness that there is a meaning is, nevertheless, so strong and clear that it forms the very foundation of my existence. And I marveled and rejoiced when the music said, "To live for God, for the soul." Now I can say that I know the meaning of life. It is to live for God, for my own soul. And this meaning, in spite of its clearness, is mysterious and miraculous. And such is the meaning of all existence. Yes, there is pride, said he to himself, turning over on his stomach and beginning to tie into a knot the stalks of grass, while trying not to break them. Not only pride of intellect, but the stupidity of intellect. Yes, it is the wickedness of intellect, he repeated. He succinctly went over in memory the course of his thought for the last 2 years, from the day when the idea of death struck him on seeing his beloved brother hopelessly sick. Then he had clearly resolved that, since man had no other prospect than suffering, death, and eternal oblivion, he must either commit suicide or find the explanation of the problem of existence, and in such manner as to see in it something more than the cruel irony of a malevolent spirit. But he had not done either, but continued to live, to think, and to feel. He had married, and had experienced new joys, which made him happy when he did not ponder on the meaning of life. What did this mean? It meant that he was thinking badly, and living well. Without knowing it, he had been sustained by those spiritual verities which he had sucked in with his mother's milk, and he indulged in thought, not only now not recognizing those truths, but even strenuously avoiding them. Now it was clear to him that he could live only through the blessed influence of the faith in which he had been taught. What should I have been? How should I have lived, if I had not absorbed these beliefs? if I had not known that I must live for God, and not for the satisfaction of my desires. I should have been a thief, a liar, a murderer. Nothing of what seems the chief joy of my life would have had any existence for me. And, though he made the most strenuous efforts of his imagination, he could not picture to himself what kind of a wild creature he might have been if he had not really known the aim of his existence. I was in search of an answer to my question, thought I could not give it, for the problem was too lofty. Life itself, with the innate knowledge of good and evil, alone could give me an answer, and this knowledge I did not acquire. It was given me, like all the rest. Given. I could not know where to get it. Did I get it from reason? But would reason ever have proved to me that I ought to love my neighbor instead of choking him? I was taught it in my childhood, but I believed it gladly because it was already existent in my soul. Reason discovered the struggle for existence, that law which demands the overthrow of every obstacle in the way of our desires. That is the result of reason. But reason has nothing to do with loving our neighbor. End of chapter 12. Part 8, Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Levin remembered a recent scene between Dolly and her children. The children had been left alone, and had amused themselves by making raspberry jam over a candle, and throwing milk into each other's faces. Their mother, catching them in the act, scolded them in their uncle's presence, and sought to make them understand how much work was involved in what they were destroying, that the labor was performed for their benefit, that, if they broke the cups, they couldn't have anything to drink from, and if they wasted the milk, they wouldn't have any more, and would starve to death. Levin was struck by the indifference and skepticism with which the children heard their mother's words. They were only sorry to have their interesting sport interrupted, and they did not believe a word of what she said. They did not believe because they did not know the value of what they were playing with, and did not understand that they were destroying their own means of subsistence. That is all very well, they thought, but there is nothing interesting or worthwhile in it, because it is always the same and always will be, and it is monotonous. We don't have to think about it. It is done for us. But we would like to do something new and original. And here we are making jam in a cup over the candle, and squirting the milk in each other's faces. It's fun. It's new, and not half so stupid as to drink milk out of a cup. Is it not thus that we act? Is it not the way I have acted, in trying to penetrate by reasoning the subjects of nature and the problem of human life? Is it not the same that all the philosophers have done with their theories which lead, by a course of reasoning strange and unnatural to man, to the knowledge of what he long has known, and known so surely that without it he could not live? Do we not see clearly, in the development of the theory of each, that the real meaning of human existence is as indubitably known as it is known to Fyodor, the muzhik? And do they see any more clearly than he does the principal meaning of life? Do they not all come back to this, even though it may be by a route which is often equivocal? If we were to leave the children to get their own living, make their own utensils, do the milking instead of playing pranks, they would die of hunger. There now, give us over to our own ideas and passions, with no knowledge of our Creator, without the consciousness of moral good and evil, and what would be the result? We reason because we are spiritually satiated. We are children. Whence comes this joyous knowledge, which I share with the muzhik, and which alone gives me serenity of spirit? Where did I get it? Here am I, a Christian, brought up in the faith, surrounded by the blessings of Christianity, living upon these spiritual blessings without being conscious of them, and like children I have been reasoning, or at least trying to reason, out the meaning of life. But in the serious moments of life, in the hour of suffering, just as when children are cold and hungry, I turn to Him, and, like these same children whom their mother reprimands for their childish faults, I feel that my childish efforts to get out of the mad circle of reasoning have done me no good. Yes, reason has taught me nothing. What I know has been given, revealed to me through the heart, and especially through faith in the teachings of the Church. The Church. The Church? Repeated Levin, turning over again, and, as he rested his head on his hand, looking at a herd of cattle down by the river at a distance. Can I really believe all that the Church teaches? Said he, to test himself and to bring up everything that might destroy his present feeling of security. He expressly called to mind the Church teachings which more than all had seemed strange to him and disgusted him. Creation? Yes. But how did I myself explain existence? Existence, the devil, sin. How did I explain evil, redemption? But I know nothing, and can know nothing except what is told me and everyone else. And now it seemed to him that not one of these Church dogmas was inimical to the great objects of life, faith in God, in goodness. On the contrary, all tended to produce that greatest of all miracles, that which consists in enabling the whole world, with its millions of human beings, young and old, the muzhik and lvov, and kitty and peasants and tsars, married and single, to comprehend the same great truths, so as to live that life of the soul which alone is worth living, and which is our only aim. Lying on his back, he looked up into the high, cloudless sky. Do I not know, thought he, that is infinity of space, and not a vault of blue stretching above me? But, however I strain my sight, I can see only a vaulted dome. And, in spite of my knowledge of infinite space, I have more satisfaction in looking at it as a blue vaulted dome than when I try to look beyond. Levin stopped thinking. He listened to the mysterious voices which seemed to wake joyfully in him. Is it really faith? He thought, fearing to believe in his happiness. My God, I thank thee, he cried, and he swallowed down the sobs that arose, and brushed away with both hands the tears that filled his eyes. End of chapter 13. Part 8, Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Levin looked away and saw the herd, and his one-horse Telyaga and his coachman, who approached the herd of cattle and began talking to the herdsman. Then he heard the sound of wheels and the neighing of the horse, but he was so occupied with his thoughts that he did not think why it was that his coachman was coming for him. He only realized it when the coachman, while still some distance off, cried, "The mistress sent for you. Your brother and another baron have come." Levin got in at once and took the reins. As if awakened from sleep, it was long before he could collect his thoughts. He looked at the well-fed horse, and at the spot on his neck where the harness rubbed, and he looked at Ivan, the coachman, sitting beside him, and he thought of how he had been expecting his brother, and that his wife was probably troubled because he was gone so long, and he tried to guess who the unknown guest who had come with his brother might be. And his brother and his wife and the unknown guest now seemed to him different from what they had been before. He felt that henceforth all his relations with these friends would be more pleasant than they had been. Now there will be no more of that coldness, such as there used to be, between my brother and me. No more disputes. Nor will Kitty and I quarrel any more. And whoever my guest is, I shall be polite to him, and kind to the servants, and to Ivan. All will be different. And holding in his good horse, which was whinnying with impatience and pleading for permission to show his paces, Levin kept looking at Ivan, who was sitting next to him, not knowing what to do with his idle hands, and constantly pulling down his shirt, which the wind tugged at, and in his attempt to find a pretext for beginning a conversation with the man, he thought of saying that the horse's girth was buckled up too tightly, but then this seemed like censuring him, and he wanted to say something pleasant. You had better turn to the right and avoid that stump," said the coachman, taking hold of one of the reins. "Please not touch, or try to give me lessons," said Levin, exasperated by his coachman's interference. Just the same as always, he was made angry by any interference with his affairs, and he immediately became conscious how mistaken he was in supposing for a moment that his new spiritual condition could keep its character unchanged on contact with the reality. When they arrived within a quarter of a verst of the house, Levin saw Grisha and Tanya running to meet him. "Uncle Kostya, Mamma is coming, and Grandpa, and Sergey Ivanovitch, and someone else," they cried as they ran up to the cart. "Tell me, who is it?" "Oh, he's an awful, horrid man, who does so with his arms," said Tanya, climbing up into the cart and mimicking Katavasov. "Tell me, is he young or old?" asked Levin, laughing, reminded of someone by Tanya's performance. "Ah, I only hope he is not a bore," said Levin to himself. As soon as they reached a turn in the road and saw the party approaching, Levin recognized Katavasov, who was in a straw hat and gesticulating exactly as Tanya had represented it. Katavasov was very fond of talking philosophy, and his conceptions were wholly drawn from the natural sciences, which had always been his specialty, and in Moscow Levin had frequently had discussions with him. And one of these discussions, in which Katavasov had evidently felt that he was victorious, occurred to Levin's mind as soon as he saw him. "Henceforth," he said to himself, "I will not enter into discussions, or express myself so flippantly." Leaping from the cart and joining Katavasov and his brother, he asked where Kitty was. "She has taken Mitya to Kolok." Kolok was a piece of woodland near the house. "She wanted to get him established there. It was so hot at the house," said Dolly. Levin always advised his wife against taking the baby into the woods, because he felt it was dangerous, so this news was not pleasant to him. "She carries that son of hers from one place to another," said the old prince. "I told her she'd better try the ice house." "She wanted to go to the beehives. She thought you were there," added Dolly. "That is where we were going." "Well, what have you been doing that's good?" said Sergey Ivanovitch, dropping behind the others and walking with his brother. "Oh, nothing particular. As usual, busy with the farming. You'll stay with us a while now? We've been expecting you a long time." "Only a fortnight. I have a great deal to do at Moscow." At these words the two brothers looked at one another, and Levin, in spite of his usual and now especially strong desire to have friendly, and above all simple, relations with his brother, felt that it was awkward for him to look at him. He dropped his eyes and was at a loss what to say. Trying to select some topic of conversation which would be agreeable to Sergey Ivanovitch, and avoiding the Serbian war and the Slavonic question, a hint at which Sergey Ivanovitch's remark about his occupation in Moscow gave, Levin began to talk about his brother's book. "Well," he asked, "have there been many reviews of your book?" Sergey Ivanovitch smiled at the intention of the question. "No one thinks anything about it. I least of all," he said. "You see, Darya Alexandrovna, we're going to have a shower," he added, pointing with his umbrella to the white clouds which were piling up above the aspen tops. It was evident by these words that the relationship between the brothers, which Levin wanted to overcome, was just the same as of old, if not unfriendly, at least cool. Levin approached Katavasov. "How good it was of you to come to us," said he. "I've wanted to come for a long time. Now we shall have time to talk. Have you read Spencer?" "Not thoroughly. I don't get anything out of him." "How so? That is interesting. Why is that?" "I've definitely made up my mind that the answers to certain questions which interest me are not to be found in him or his followers. Now—" But he was suddenly struck by the pleasant and serene expression of Katavasov's face, and he felt so sorry at having evidently disturbed his mental equilibrium by his remark that, suddenly remembering his resolution, he stopped short. "However, we will talk about that by and by," he added. "If we are going to the apiary, let us go this way, by this path," he said, turning to the others. Passing through a narrow path along by an unmown field, covered on one side with an abundance of those bright flowers called Ivan da Maria, and in the midst of which grew frequent patches of the tall, dark green hellebore, Levin led his guests, who were afraid of being stung, to the cool, dense shade of some young aspens, and established them on some benches and logs especially prepared for the purpose of receiving the beehives, and he himself went to the storehouse to fetch for the children, and the grown people as may, some bread, cucumbers, and fresh honey. Trying to make as little disturbance as possible, and listening to the bees, which came flying more and more thickly around him, he strode along the path that led to the izba. At the very door a bee entangled in his beard and began to buzz, but he carefully freed himself from it. Going into the cool entry, he took his wire mask down from the peg where it hung and put it on, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, he went into the enclosure of the apiary, where, amid a smoothly shaven lawn, stood in straight rows on linden stakes all the old hives, each having for him its own special history, while the newer ones which had been set up that year were ranged along the wall. At the entrance of the hives he could see the young bees and the drones clustering together and tumbling over one another, while in their midst the working bees were industriously darting off in a straight line toward the forest where the linden trees were in bloom, and quickly returning laden with their pollen. His ears were filled with the incessant, monotonous humming made by the workers as they flew in with their burdens, by the drones enjoying their holiday, and by the guardian bees giving warning of the approach of an enemy and ready to sting. On one side of the enclosure the old beekeeper was smoothing a hoop, and did not see Levin, and Levin, without speaking to him, stood in the midst of his apiary. He was glad of the chance of being alone, so as to collect himself in face of the reality which had so suddenly come into vivid contrast with his recent state of mind. He remembered that he had already been angry with Ivan, and shown coldness to his brother, and had spoken foolishly with Katavasov. Can it be possible that my happiness was only a transitory feeling, which will pass away and leave no trace behind? But at the same moment as he analyzed his state of mind, he felt with joy that his experience had left new and important results. Practical life had only temporarily disturbed the spiritual calm which he had found, but in his heart it was still intact. Just as the bees, buzzing around him, threatened him, and robbed him of his physical calm, and compelled him to defend himself, so did the cares which surrounded him, as he sat in his little cart, disturb his spiritual calm, but this lasted only while he was in their midst. Just as his physical strength was intact while he was defending himself against the bees, so his newly attained spiritual power was also unimpaired. End of chapter 14. Part 8, Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. "Do you know, Kostya, whom Sergey Ivanovitch found on the train?" said Dolly, after she had given her children their cucumbers and honey. "Vronsky. He's going to Serbia." "Yes, and not alone either. He's taking out a squadron of cavalry at his own expense," said Katavasov. "That's like him," answered Levin. "But are volunteers still going off?" he added, looking at Sergey Ivanovitch. Sergey Ivanovitch was busy with a knife blade rescuing a live bee from the honey that had flowed out of the white honeycomb at the bottom of his cup, and he did not answer. "Indeed, I should say so," said Katavasov, biting into a cucumber. "If you had only seen them at the station this morning. Now, what an idea this is! For Christ's sake, tell me, Sergey Ivanovitch, where all these volunteers are going, and whom they are going to fight with?" asked the old prince, evidently pursuing a conversation which they had begun before Levin joined them. "With the Turks," answered Sergey Ivanovitch, smiling quietly, as he at last rescued the helpless honey-smeared bee on the point of his knife and set him on an aspen leaf. "But who has declared war on the Turks? Is it Ivan Ivanovitch Ragozov, and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, and Madame Stahl?" "No one has declared war, but people sympathize with their oppressed brethren and want to help them," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "The prince was not speaking here of help, but of war," said Levin, coming to the assistance of his father-in-law. "The prince means that private persons have no right to take part in a war without being authorized by the government." "Kostya, look out! There's a bee. Won't he sting?" cried Dolly, defending herself from a wasp. "That's not a bee, that's a wasp," said Levin. Come now, give us your theory, demanded Katavasov, evidently provoking Levin into a discussion. Why shouldn't private persons have that right? Well, my theory is this. War, on the one hand, is such a terrible, such an atrocious thing that no man, at least no Christian man, has the right to assume the responsibility of beginning it, but it belongs to government alone when it becomes inevitable. On the other hand, both in law and in common sense, where there are state questions, and above all matters concerning war, private citizens have no right to use their own wills. Sergey Ivanovitch and Katavasov were both ready at the same instant with answers. That's where you're mistaken, Bayushka, said Katavasov. There may be cases when government does not carry out the will of its citizens, and then society declares its own will. But Sergey Ivanovitch did not approve of this reply. He frowned as Katavasov spoke, and put it another way. You state the question all wrong. Here there is no declaration of war, but simply an expression of human, of Christian sympathy. Our brethren, men of the same blood, the same faith, are butchered. Now, we do not merely regard them as brethren, and as co-religionists, but as women, children, old men. Our feelings are stirred, and the whole Russian people fly to help check these horrors. Suppose you were walking in the street and saw a drunken man beating a woman or a child. I think you would not stop to ask whether war had been declared or had not been declared on such a man before you attacked him and protected the object of his fury. No, but I should not kill him. Yes, you might even kill him. I don't know. If I saw such a sight, I might yield to the immediate feeling. I cannot tell how it would be. But in the oppression of the Slavs, there is not, and cannot be, such a powerful motive. Perhaps not for you, but other people think differently, said Sergey Ivanovitch, angrily. The people still keep the tradition of sympathy with brethren of the Orthodox faith who are groaning under the yoke of the unspeakable Turk. They have heard of their terrible sufferings and are aroused. That may be, answered Levin, in a conciliatory tone. Only I don't see it. I myself am one of the people, and I don't feel it. I can say the same, put in the old prince. I was living abroad. I read the newspapers, and I learned about the Bulgarian atrocities, but I could never understand why all Russia took such a sudden fancy for their Slavic brethren. I am sure I never felt the slightest love for them. I was greatly ashamed. I thought I must either be a monster, or that Carlsbad had a bad effect on me. But since I have come back, I don't feel stirred at all, and I find that I am not the only one who is not so much interested in the Slav brethren as in Russia. Here is Constantine. Private opinions are of no consequence. There is no meaning in private opinions, when all Russia, when the whole people, signified what they wished, said Sergey Ivanovitch. Yes, excuse me, I don't see this. The people don't know anything, said the prince. But Papa, how about Sunday in church? Said Dolly, who had been listening to the conversation. Give me a towel, please, she said in an aside to the old beekeeper, who was looking at the children with a friendly smile. It can't be that all... Well, what about Sunday at church? They tell the priest to read a prayer. He reads it. Nobody understands one word. They snore just as they do during the whole sermon, continued the prince. Then they tell them that the salvation of their souls is in question. They pull out their kopecks and give them. But why they have not the least idea. The people cannot know their destiny. They have an instinctive feeling, and at times like this they show it, said Sergey Ivanovitch, looking at the old beekeeper. The handsome, tall old man, with his black beard, wherein a few grey hairs were beginning to show, and with his thick, silvery hair, stood motionless, holding a cup of honey in his hand, looking at the gentleman with a mild, placid air, evidently not understanding a word of the conversation, nor caring to understand. He nodded his head with deliberation as he heard Sergey Ivanovitch's words, and said, "That's certainly so." "Well now, ask him about it," said Levin. "He doesn't know. He doesn't think. Have you heard about the war, Mikhailovitch?" asked he of the old man. "You know what was read in Sunday at church, don't you? What do you think? Ought we to fight for the Christians?" "Why should we think? Our Emperor, Alexander Nikolaevich, will think for us, as in everything else. He knows what to do. Should you like some more bread? Shall I give some to the little lad?" asked he, turning to Darya Alexandrovna and pointing to Grisha, who was munching a crust. "What's the use of asking him?" said Sergey Ivanovitch. "We have seen, and still see, hundreds and hundreds of men abandoning all they possess, giving their last penny, enlisting and trooping from every corner of Russia, all clearly and definitely expressing their thought and purpose. What does that signify?" "It signifies, in my opinion," said Levin, beginning to get excited, "that out of 80 millions of men there will always be found hundreds, and even thousands, who have lost their social position, are restless, and are ready to take up the first adventure that comes along, whether it is to follow Pugatchov, or to go to Khiva, or to fight in Serbia." "I tell you they are not adventurers who devote themselves to this work, but they are the best representatives of the nation," cried Sergey Ivanovitch, excitedly, as if he were defending his last position. "There are the contributions. Isn't that a test of popular feeling?" "The word people is so vague," said Levin. "Long-haired scribblers, professors, and perhaps 1 in 1,000 among the peasants understand what it is all about. But the rest of the 80 millions do as Mikhailovitch here does. They not only don't express their will, but they haven't the slightest idea that they have any will to express. What right, then, have we to say that this is the will of the people?" End of chapter 15. Part 8, Chapter 16 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Sergey Ivanovitch was skilled in dialectics, and without replying he took up another side of the question. "Yes, if you want to get at the mind of the nation by an arithmetical process, of course it will be very hard work. We have not the proper gifts, and cannot reckon it that way. But there are other means of learning it besides arithmetic. It is felt in the air, it is felt in the heart, not to speak of those submarine currents which flow through the stagnant ocean of the people and which are evident to every unprejudiced person. Take society in a narrower sense. Take the intelligent classes, and see how on this point even the most hostile parties combine. There is no longer a difference of opinions. All the organs of society express the same thing. They have all become aware of an elemental force which fills the nation with its own motive power." "Yes, the newspapers all say the same thing, that is true," said the old prince. "But then, so do all the frogs croak before a storm. That doesn't signify much." "Whether frogs or not, I don't edit newspapers, and I don't set up to defend them. I am talking of the unanimity of opinion among intelligent people," said Sergey Ivanovitch, turning to his brother. Levin was about to reply, but the old prince took the words from his mouth. "Well, something else may be said in regard to that unanimity. Here is my son-in-law, Stepan Arkadyevitch, you know. He has just been appointed a member of some commission or other, I don't know what, with a salary of 8,000 a year, and nothing to do. Now, Dolly, that's not a secret. Ask him if his office is useful. He will tell you that it is indispensable. And he is an upright man, but you could not make him cease to believe in his full 8,000 salary." "Oh, yes, he told me to tell Darya Alexandrovna that he had got that place," said Sergey Ivanovitch, angrily, considering that the Prince's remark was not apropos. "Of course the newspapers are unanimous. That is easily explained. War will double their circulation. How can they help supporting the Slavic question and the national instinct?" "I don't like many of the papers, but you are unjust," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "I will only add one more suggestion," said the old prince. "Alphonse Karr wrote a clever thing just before the Franco-Prussian War, when he said, 'You say this war is absolutely necessary? Very good. Go to the front then, and be under the first fire, and lead the first onslaught.'" "Good editors would be glad to do that," said Katavasov, with a loud laugh, and trying to imagine certain editorial friends of his in this chosen legion. "Yes, but when they ran away," said Dolly, "they'd bother the others." Just as soon as they begin to run, put a Matarans behind them, or some Cossacks with whips," said the prince. "Well, that's a joke, but not a very good joke. Excuse me, prince," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "I don't think it was a joke," said Levin. "It was—" But his brother interrupted him. "Every member of society is called upon to do his duty," said he, "and thoughtful men perform theirs by giving expression to public opinion, and the unanimous and full expression of public opinion is creditable to the press, and at the same time a good symptom. 20 years ago we should have kept quiet. Today we hear the voice of the Russian people, which is ready to rise like one man, and ready to sacrifice itself for its oppressed brethren. It is a great step taken, a proof of power." "Yes, not only to avenge their brethren, but to kill the Turks," said Levin timidly. "The people will sacrifice itself, and be ready to sacrifice itself for the salvation of their souls, but not for murder," he added, involuntarily connecting this conversation with the thoughts of the morning. "What do you mean by soul? That, to a naturalist, you must remember, is a very puzzling expression. What is the soul?" demanded Katavasov with a smile. "Oh, you know." "'Pon my word, I haven't the least idea." And the professor broke into a burst of laughter. "Christ said, 'I am not come to bring peace, but a sword,'" remarked Sergey Ivanovitch, quoting as simply as if it were something comprehensible a passage from the Gospel which had always troubled Levin. "That's just so," replied the old beekeeper, who had been standing near them, in response to a chance look directed to him. "Come, Batyushka, you're beaten, wholly beaten!" cried Katavasov gaily. Levin reddened with vexation, not because he was beaten, but because he had been drawn into discussion again. "No, it is impossible for me to dispute with them," he thought. "Their armor is impenetrable, and I am defenseless." He saw that he could not defeat his brother and Katavasov, and it was equally impossible to agree with them. Their arguments were the fruit of that same pride of the intellect which had almost ruined him. He could not admit that a handful of men, his brother among them, had the right, on the ground of what was told them by a few hundred eloquent volunteers who came to the capital, to claim that they and the newspapers expressed the will and sentiment of the people, especially when this sentiment expressed itself in vengeance and butchery. He could not agree with this because he did not discover the expression of these thoughts among the people in whose midst he lived, and he did not find them in himself, and he could not consider himself as anything else than one of the men constituting the Russian nation, but principally because he did not, any more than the rest of men, know, nor could he know, what constituted the general good, but he firmly believed that the attainment of this general good was brought about only by the strenuous fulfillment of that law of right which is revealed to everyone, and therefore he could not desire war, or preach it as a means of attaining any general end whatever. He and Mikhailovitch, and the people in general, expressed themselves in somewhat the same language as was used when the early Russians invited the Varyags to come from Scandinavia. "Come and rule over us. We gladly promise absolute submission. We are enduring all trials, all humiliations, all sacrifices, but we do not judge and we do not decide." And now, according to Sergey Ivanovitch, the people were ready to turn their backs on a right which they had purchased at such a price. He wanted to say in addition that if the general opinion is an infallible judge, then why should not the revolution, the commune, be as useful to the Slavs as lawful means? But all these were thoughts which could not decide anything. The only thing that he could clearly see was that at the present moment the discussion was exasperating to Sergey Ivanovitch, and therefore it was wrong to discuss it. So Levin held his peace and turned the attention of his guests to the clouds that were rolling up, and he advised them to hurry home if they did not want to get wet. End of chapter 16. Part 8, Chapter 17 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. The prince and Sergey Ivanovitch seated themselves in the cart and drove on. The rest of the party, quickening their steps, started back on foot. But the thunderstorm, white on top, black underneath, came up so rapidly that they had to hurry so as to reach the house before the rain was on them. The clouds coming on as the vanguard, hung low, were as black as soot, and drove across the sky with extraordinary rapidity. They had reached within 200 feet of the house, and already the wind had begun to rise, and the downpour might be expected at any second. The children ran on ahead, laughing and screaming with delight and terror. Darya Alexandrovna, struggling with her skirts, which the wind blew round her legs, no longer walked, but ran, not letting the children out of her sight. The gentlemen, holding on their hats with difficulty, walked with long strides. They had just reached the porch when the great drops began to strike and splash against the edge of the iron gutter. The children, and just behind them their elders, with gay exclamations, ran under the shelter of the porch. "Where's Katerina Alexandrovna?" asked Levin of Agafya Mikhailovna, who was coming out of the door, loaded with shawls and plaids. "We supposed she was with you." "And Mitya?" "He must be in the Kolak woods with his nurse." Levin seized the plaids and started for Kolak. In the few minutes that had elapsed, the storm had reached beyond the sun, and it was as dark as if there was an eclipse. The wind blew obstinately, as if insisting on its own way, tried to stop Levin, and, tearing off the leaves and flowers from the lindens, and rudely and strangely bearing the white branches of the birches, bent everything to one side, acacias, flowers, burdocks, the grass, and the tree-tops. The girls working in the garden ran squealing under the shelter of the servants' quarters. The white screen of the pouring rain had already cut off the distant forest and half of the adjacent field, and was rapidly advancing on Kolak. The dampness of the shower was felt in the atmosphere like fine drops. Bending his head and fighting vigorously against the gale, which tugged at his shawls, Levin was already on his way to Kolak. He thought he already saw white forms behind a well-known oak, when suddenly a glare of light seemed to burst from the ground before him, and the vault of the sky above him fall with a crash. When he opened his dazzled eyes, he looked through the thick curtain formed by the rain, which cut him off from the Kolak woods, and saw, to his horror, that the green top of a well-known oak which stood in the forest had strangely changed its position. Even before he could ask, "Can the lightning have struck it?" he saw it bending over more and more rapidly, and then disappeared behind the other trees, and he heard the crash the great oak made as it fell, carrying with it the neighboring trees. The glare of the lightning, the crash of the thunder, and the sensation of chill running over his whole body blended for Levin in one impression of horror. My God, keep them safe!" he exclaimed. And though he instantly felt the absurdity of the prayer, since the oak had already fallen, he nevertheless said it over and over, for he knew that, absurd as it was, he could not do anything else to help them. He hastened toward the spot where they generally went, but he did not find them. They were in another part of the woods under an old linden, and they called to him. 2 figures dressed in dark clothes, they usually wore white, were bending over something under the trees. It was Kitty and the nurse. The rain had stopped, and it was beginning to grow lighter when Levin reached them. The bottom of the nurse's dress was dry, but Kitty's gown was wet through and clung to her. Though it was no longer raining, they were standing just as they had been when the shower began. Both were leaning over the baby carriage with its green parasol. "Alive! Safe! God be praised!" he cried, as, splashing through the puddles, he ran to them with his shoes full of water. Kitty's glowing face, all wet, was turned to him, and she smiled timidly from under her hat, which had lost its shape in the rain. "There now, aren't you ashamed? I can't understand how you could do such a careless thing," he began in his vexation, scolding his wife. "Goodness, it was not my fault. We were just starting to go when he began to be restless. We had to change him. We were just—" Kitty said, trying to defend herself. Mitya was safe, dry, and still soundly sleeping. "Well, God be thanked. I don't know what I'm saying." They hastily picked up the wet diapers. The nurse took the baby, and Levin, ashamed of his vexation, gave his arm to his wife, and led her away, pressing her hand gently. End of chapter 17. Part 8, Chapter 18 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. In the course of all that day, during the most varied conversations in which Levin took part, as it were, only with the external side of his mind, and notwithstanding his disillusion at finding that the moral regeneration had not taken place in his nature after all, he did not cease to be pleasantly conscious that his heart was full. After the shower, it was too wet to go out for a walk, and, moreover, other threatening clouds were piling up on the horizon, and here and there reaching up high into the sky, black and laden with thunder. All the household spent the rest of the day within doors. Discussions were avoided, and after dinner all were in the gayest frame of mind. Katavasov at first kept the ladies laughing by his original turns of wit, which always pleased people when they made his acquaintance. Then afterward, being drawn out by Sergey Ivanovitch, he related his very interesting observations on the different characteristics and features of male and female flies, and their habits. Sergey Ivanovitch also was very gay, and at tea he explained the future of the Eastern question so simply and well that all could follow him. Kitty alone did not hear him. She had been summoned to the nursery to give Mitya his bath. A few moments after Kitty had left the room, Levin also was called to follow her. Leaving his tea, and feeling regretful at having an interesting conversation interrupted, and at the same time troubled because they had called him to the nursery, a thing which had hitherto happened only in cases of emergency, Levin followed his wife. In spite of the fact that he was greatly interested in his brother's partly outlined scheme of making the newly enfranchised world of 40 million Slavs join with Russia in establishing a new epoch in history, for it was something entirely novel to him, in spite of his curiosity and anxiety at having been summoned to the nursery, as soon as he had left the drawing-room and was once more alone, he immediately remembered his thoughts of the morning. And all these theories as to the significance of the Slav element in the universal history seemed to him so insignificant in comparison with what was taking place in his own soul, that for a moment he forgot all about it, and returned to the moral state that had so delighted him at the beginning of the day. This time he did not wholly retrace the course of thought which had led him to this state of mind, nor was it necessary. He was borne immediately back to that feeling which had guided him, which had been connected with those thoughts, and he now found the feeling stronger and more definite in his soul than ever before. Now there was no longer what had always marked his previous imaginary attempts at gaining spiritual calmness, when he had been obliged to call a halt to the whole course of his thoughts in order to find the feeling. Now, on the contrary, the feeling of joy and calmness was more vivid than before, but thought did not overtake the feeling. He walked along the terrace and saw 2 stars glowing in the already darkening sky, and suddenly he remembered a course of reasoning. "Yes," he said to himself, "as I looked at the heavens I thought that the vault which I gaze at is not a lie. But there was something that remained half thought out in my mind, something that I hid from myself. Now, what was it? There cannot be an answer. If one could think it out, all things would be explained." Just as he entered the child's chamber, he remembered what it was that he hid from himself. It was this: if the chief proof of the existence of God lies in the revelation of good, why should this revelation be limited to the Christian Church? How about those millions of Buddhists and Mohammedans who are also seeking for the truth and doing right? It seemed to him that there must be an answer to this question, but he could not find and express it before entering the room. Kitty, with her sleeves rolled up, was bending over the bathtub, in which she was washing the baby. As she heard her husband's steps, she turned her face to him, and with a smile called him to her. With one hand she was supporting the head of the plump little fellow, who was floating on his back in the water and kicking with his legs. With the other she was squeezing the sponge on him. "Come here, look, look," she said as her husband came up to her. "Agafya Mikhailovna is right. He knows us." The fact was that Mitya today for the first time gave indubitable proof that he knew his friends. As soon as Levin went to the bathtub, the experiment was tried, and it was wholly successful. A cook, who was called for the purpose, bent over the tub. The baby frowned and shook his head. Kitty bent over him, and he smiled radiantly, and clung with his little hands to the sponge, and sucked with his lips, producing such a strange and contented sound that not only the mother and nurse, but Levin himself, were enchanted. They took the baby from the water, wiped him, and after he had expressed his disapprobation with a piercing scream, they gave him to his mother. "Well, I am very glad to see that you begin to love him," said Kitty, as she sat down in a comfortable seat with the child at her breast. "I am very glad. It really troubled me when you said you hadn't any feelings for him."
"No. Did I say that I had no feeling for him? I only said that I was disappointed."
"How were you disappointed?"
"I wasn't disappointed in him, but in the feeling that he would arouse. I expected more. I expected as a surprise some new and pleasant feeling, and instead of that it was pity, disgust."
She listened to him as she put on her slender fingers the rings which she had taken off while bathing the baby.
"And more of fear and pity than of satisfaction. I never knew until today, after the storm, how much I loved him."
Kitty smiled with radiant joy. "Were you very much afraid?" she asked. "And so was I. But it seems more terrible to me now when the danger is all past. I shall go and look at the oak tomorrow. How nice Katavasov is! Well, the whole day has been so pleasant. You are so delightful with your brother when you want to be. Well, go to them. It is always hot and stifling in here after the bath." End of chapter 18. Part 8, Chapter 19 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Levin, on leaving the nursery and finding himself alone, began to follow out his line of thought, in which there had been something obscure. Instead of going back to the drawing-room, where he heard the sound of voices, he remained on the terrace, and, leaning over the balustrade of the terrace, he looked at the sky. It had grown very dark, and there was not a cloud in the south where he was looking. The clouds were all in the opposite quarter. From time to time it would lighten, and the distant thunder would be heard. Levin listened to the drops of rain falling rhythmically from the lindens, and looked at the stars, and then at the Milky Way. Whenever the lightning flashed, then not only the Milky Way but also the bright stars would disappear from his vision, but by the time the thunder sounded they would reappear in their places, as if a careful hand had readjusted them in the firmament.
"Well, now what is it that troubles me?"
Levin asked himself, already beginning to feel that a resolution of his doubts, though it had not yet become a matter of knowledge, was ready in his soul.
Yes, there is one evident, indubitable manifestation of the divinity, and that is the laws of right which are made known to the world through revelation, and of which I am conscious as existing in myself, and in the recognition of them I am, in spite of myself, willingly or unwillingly, united with other men into one brotherhood of believers, which is called the Church. Yes, but are Hebrews, Confucians, Mohammedans, Buddhists, in the same relation?
He asked himself, recurring to the dilemma which had seemed so portentous to him.
Can these hundreds of millions of men be deprived of the greatest of blessings, of that which alone gives a meaning to life?
He paused, but immediately recovered his train of thought.
What am I asking myself? I am questioning the revelation of the various forms of human belief to divinity. I am questioning the revelation of God to the whole universe with all its nebulae. But what am I doing? And at the moment when knowledge, sure though inaccessible to reason, is revealed to me, shall I still persist in dragging in logic? Do I not know that the stars do not move? Said he, noticing the change that had taken place in the position of the brilliant planet which he had seen rising over the birches. But, seeing the stars change place, and not being able to imagine the revolution of the earth, then I should be right in saying that they moved. Could the astronomers have made any calculations and gained any knowledge if they had taken into consideration the varied and complicated motions of the earth? Have not their marvelous conclusions as to the distances, the weight, the motions, and revolutions of the celestial bodies all been based on the apparent movements of the stars around a motionless earth? These very movements which I now witness, as millions of men for centuries have witnessed them, and which can always be verified. And just as the conclusion of the astronomers would have been inaccurate and false if they had not been based on their observations of the heavens, such as they appeared relatively to a single meridian and a single horizon, so all my conclusions as to the knowledge of good and evil would be inaccurate and false if they were not founded on that comprehension of good and evil which for all men always has been and always will be one and the same, and which Christianity has revealed to me and which my soul can always verify. The relations of human belief to God must, for me, remain unfathomable. To search them out belongs not to me.
"Haven't you gone in yet?" said Kitty's voice suddenly. She was on her way to the drawing-room, by the way of the terrace. "There's nothing that troubles you, is there?" she asked, looking wistfully up into her husband's face, and trying to study its expression by the starlight. By the light of a flash of lightning on the horizon, she saw that he was calm and happy, and she smiled.
She understands me, thought he. She knows what I am thinking. Shall I tell her, or not? Yes, I will tell her.
But just as he was about to speak, Kitty broke in. "Kostya," said she, "do be so kind and go to the corner room and see how they have arranged for Sergey Ivanovitch." "I don't like to. See if they put in the new washstand properly."
"Certainly. I'll go,"
answered Levin, rising and kissing her.
No, better be silent,
thought he as she went past.
The secret has no importance save for me alone, and words could not explain it. This new feeling has neither changed me, nor suddenly enlightened me, nor made me happy, as I imagined it would. It is just like my feeling for my son. There is no element of surprise in it. But it is faith. No, not faith. I know not what it is. But the feeling stole into my soul through suffering, and there it is firmly established. I shall continue to be vexed with Ivan the coachman, and get into useless discussions, and express my thoughts blunderingly. I shall always be blaming my wife for what annoys me, and repenting at once. I shall always find a certain barrier between the holy of holies of my inmost soul and the souls of others, even my wife's. I shall continue to pray without being able to explain to myself why. But my whole life, every moment of my life, independently of whatever may happen to me, will be, not meaningless as before, but full of the deep meaning which I shall have the power to impress upon it.
End of chapter 19, and end of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. This LibriVox audiobook was read to you by Marianne Spiegel in Chicago, Illinois. Production was handled by a team of dedicated LibriVox volunteers, including Anne from Melbourne, Australia, Stav from Israel, and Hugh from Lancaster, California. We all thank you for listening.